Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. Both of those of you who are here in the room and those watching remotely online, we're glad that you're here for what's going to be, I think, a really interesting discussion about some new material that we're proud to be associated with. Today's event is titled, Can We Strengthen Marriage? Lessons from the Culture of Freedom Initiative in Jacksonville, Florida, and we've got a very talented and interesting group of speakers for you today. My name is Ryan Streeter. I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here at AEI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here. We've known now for some time from a growing body of social science literature that marriage has a number of benefits both for individuals and for children. Yeah, we're proud that some of our own scholars at AEI have contributed to this literature, and we've been able to see over the years just an overwhelming body of evidence of the positive effects, long-term effects on children by being raised in stable two-parent married households, despite whatever cultural stereotypes and assumptions there might be out there. Even recently, our survey research has shown the positive impact of marriage on reducing levels of loneliness that you don't see in cohabitation or in unmarried households, and the evidence just keeps piling up. But there's a lingering question about whether programmatic interventions can actually strengthen marriage or encourage marriage in the first place. And that's why we're here today. So we were first off today, we're going to hear from a couple of authors of the report on which today's event is based. AEI visiting scholar and UVA associate professor and senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, Brad Wilcox, will be joined by Spencer James, who's an associate professor at Brigham Young University in the School of Family Life. They're two of the co-authors on this report. And so we'll start today with the presentations from them about their new study on the Culture of Freedom Initiative in Jacksonville, Florida. And after the presentations, we'll hear panel reactions and a conversation that Brad will moderate, and a panel that will include AEI Research Fellow Angela Rashidi, J.P. DeGance, who's the President and CEO of Communio, which is the follow-on organization to the Culture of Freedom Initiative, and then also Dr. James. And so before we do that, in order to set the stage and give more background on why we're here today, I'd like to introduce Catherine Haley, who's the Senior Director of Education Programs from the Philanthropy Roundtable, which sponsored this project. So Catherine, please join us up here at the podium.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you all here at AEI for inviting myself and my colleagues from the Philanthropy Roundtable to be here for the release of this report that conducted by the Institute for Family Studies entitled Declining Divorce in Jacksonville, Did the Culture of Freedom Initiative Make a Difference? The Philanthropy Roundtable's mission is to serve donors by fostering excellence in philanthropy, protecting philanthropic freedom, and helping them advance liberty, opportunity, and personal responsibility. It is our belief that donors are uniquely capable to strengthen a free society. The Roundtable serves donors in a variety of ways, through convenings, through connections, through consultations, and regardless of the topic of interest, a common thread in our work is a commitment to strengthening a free society, as well as advancing upward mobility. Whether it's giving students access to an excellent education, or breaking down barriers to work, or supporting veterans as they transition back into civilian life, it is our commitment to strengthening causes that support human flourishing by pursuing philanthropic excellence. And throughout the Roundtable's history, we have launched new initiatives to explore important topics that we believe will be helpful to donors as they try to fulfill their philanthropic mission. And the Culture of Freedom Initiative was exactly one of those initiatives. We know, as Ryan just stated, and through a large body of work, that marital health and family stability are key predictors of upward mobility. Researchers have found that children in two-parent homes are less likely to grow up in poverty and are more likely to flourish in school and work. Similarly, others have shown that stable marriages not lead to stronger well-being, financial and economic stability, and greater likelihood of upward mobility. Under the vision and direction of J.P. DeGance, the Culture of Freedom Initiative used a customized digital strategy to strengthen marriages and family life and connect those people to strong networks of churches in 3 different regions throughout the country. specifically Duval County and the Jacksonville area, Maricopa County, which is the Phoenix area, and Montgomery County and the Dayton area of Ohio. COFI, known as the Culture of Freedom Initiative, launched in 2016 in these 3 counties, and over time, the initiative concentrated its efforts in the Jacksonville area. And today, we are here to discuss the results of this 3-year intervention. Specifically, was the COFI initiative responsible for the dramatic decline in divorce in Duval County? The Institute for Family Studies, led by Brad Wilcox, would say yes. And yet, there may be other factors that contributed to the dramatic 24% decline decline in divorce that are difficult to measure. Unlike other marriage and relationship initiatives, COFI used a digital air campaign combined with an extensive in-person ground game to convey to residents that marriage matters. So from 2016 to 2018, the initiative generated more than 28 million digital impressions, directed people to the jacksmarriage.org website, promoting that it's never too early nor too late to invest in your marriage, as well as connected individuals to 50 local churches, 40 nonprofits, all of which were committed to helping individuals strengthen their marriage. And then finally, more than 50 individuals participated in 50 COFI-sponsored events. From the beginning, COFI was envisioned to become an independent organization, and today, JP DeGance leads Communio, an organization that is committed to serving and equipping churches and communities to build out proven, data-informed strategies that strengthen families, marriage, and faith. JP, it's really great to see you today, and the Roundtable is incredibly proud of the work that you are doing with Communio. On behalf of my colleagues at the Roundtable, we're grateful to you, Ryan. We're thankful for you and your research, Brad, and your team, and JP, and we are grateful that we can be here for the release of this report. Thank you so much.
So I'd like to extend my thanks to Ryan for hosting us today and to Catherine and Adam Meyerson at the Roundtable for commissioning this report. I'd like to begin our time today by sort of thinking about 3 different questions that go right to the heart of some of the most important public concerns facing our nation today. The first question is, what do you think is the best community predictor of rags to riches mobility for poor kids in America? The second question is, what do you think is the best neighborhood predictor of incarceration for boys in America? And the third question is, what do you think is the best predictor of the racial divide in poverty in America? You probably can guess where I'm headed with this line of questioning. Because when you kind of look at the research, what you see is that work by Harvard's Raj Chetty, by me and my colleagues, and by Penn State's John Iceland tell us that family structure is one of the most powerful predictors of economic mobility, of incarceration, and of racial inequality in America. Of course, this is a social fact that's often passed over in the media today, not to mention in polite company. You know, it's hard for us to talk about the fact that what happens in our families doesn't just stay in a private little bubble, but kind of ripples out oftentimes into our schools and our streets, and our communities and our country at large. But it's true, nevertheless, that some of our biggest problems in America run right through the family. And in fact, I think we're now seeing kind of a new consensus among the most serious scholars who study family life today that marriage matters, that family matters, that kids are most likely to thrive when they're being raised by an intact, married family, as this quote here from Princeton sociologist Sarah McClanahan and from Brookings economist Bell Sawhill suggests to us. So there's kind of this consensus that's emerged about the importance of family, about the importance of marriage for our kids and our communities. But kind of in the face of this new consensus, I think a question that sort of haunts a lot of us is, can anything be done to strengthen marriage, to strengthen families? And this is particularly kind of a question that vexes us because there are two awkward social facts facing us on these issues. And the one of those facts is that we've seen a pretty dramatic retreat from marriage from the 60s to the present, where about 90% of kids were being raised by married parents in 1960, and today only about 65% of kids are being raised by married parents. And I think it's also the case, too, that a lot of public initiatives have met with kind of mixed success when it comes to their ability to kind of move the dial on the marriage and family fronts. We've seen good results out of Oklahoma and the PACT programs, for instance, but we've seen disappointing results associated with other efforts, other initiatives to strengthen marriage and family life in the US. So kind of in light of this, one question that I've had is, can civic initiatives achieve some success in advancing the strength and stability of marriage and family life? You know, might a civic initiative that provides couples with a compelling vision about what marriage can and should be, that supports couples through programs and in-person relationships, and that compellingly communicates that vision online in a specific community, be more successful than a publicly funded effort that's more constrained when it comes to fostering the specific values and virtues that sustain strong and stable marriages? That is, might a civic initiative that works directly with churches, nonprofits, and social media end up strengthening marriage in ways that public programs oftentimes have not? So the Roundtable asked me and my colleagues to kind of look at this question by focusing specifically on the Culture of Freedom Initiative and its work in Jacksonville from 2016 to 2018. Catherine's kind of given you already some of the statistics that sort of summarize the both kind of the air campaign and the ground campaign that Kofi undertook, including reaching about 50,000 people in Jacksonville, including having about 28 million different digital impressions in Jacksonville, and spending about $5 million, to strengthen marriages, to strengthen families in the Jacksonville area. So the question, of course, is what effect did it have on marriage and family life in Jacksonville, Florida? And so to answer that question, I'm going to turn over the podium to my colleague Spencer James to kind of look at some of the evidence that we have come up with and trying to assess whether or not this initiative may have had an impact on marriage and family life in Jacksonville, Florida. So with that, I'll turn it over to Spencer.
All right. Well, first, I just want to begin by thanking our hosts here at AEI and all of you for coming, and also thank my colleagues and co-authors on this report. As Brad mentioned, I'm Spencer James. I'm an associate professor in the School of Family Life and a fellow with the Wheatley Institution there at BYU. Now, there were kind of two different questions that we took on here, and I really only addressed the first. So question number one is, was the divorce decline that we observed in Duval County exceptional? And then number two is, did the Culture of Freedom Initiative cause that? As sort of the senior quantitative analyst on this project, I'm prepared to speak to the second. I'll have some very brief thought, to speak on the first, I'll have some very brief thoughts on the causality question. It's hard, if not impossible, to say that this is causal simply because this was not a random control trial. But let's first look at the evidence. Now, I wanted to start by sort of providing the context in terms of what's happening with divorce in the United States. So here we have what's happened to the divorce rate in the United States over the past 2 decades. And as you can see, divorce in the year 2000 was at about 4 divorces per 1,000 people in the population. This number has declined to about 3 in 2017, which is the year for which we have the most recently available data. Now, this suggests that the pace of change in divorce rates in the United States is about half of a divorce per decade. And of course, this isn't just starting in the year 2000. Indeed, divorce rates have been falling since the mid-'80s when they peaked. So just to put a little bit of a personal impression on that, I was in diapers when the divorce rate started to fall in the United States. In other words, this is nothing new. Now, here we have what's happened in Florida. Florida, as you can see as a state, has also experienced this similar decline in divorce rates. Divorce rates have been falling for a long time. They've been falling in virtually every state. Florida is no exception, from a high of about 5.1 in the year 2000 to about 3.6, suggesting that the overall pattern in Florida is similar to that of the United States, maybe a little bit quicker, but not dramatically so. Now, of course, we want to show Florida because we know that there are unique characteristics that each state has that make it a different beast entirely. But what about Duval County itself? It's worth noting that Duval County in the year 2000 had a divorce rate that was 1.5 times the divorce rate for the United States as a whole. As with Florida and the general United States, we still see a drop in that divorce rate. That is what we would expect. But the pace of change has been quite different in Duval County compared to both Florida and the United States as a whole, falling from 6.2 divorces per 1,000 people in the population to right about 3. So what does that mean? It means that divorce in Duval County during this period over the past 2 decades has fallen from about 1.5 times or 50% higher than the nation as a whole to 2017, where we're at about the same rate. I also want to draw your attention to what happened between 2015 to 2017. If you look at it, it fell by about 1 point, meaning that Duval County experienced the same absolute fall in the number of divorces per 1,000 people in a 2-year period that the United States experienced in almost 2 decades, suggesting that there may be something here that's worth examining. Now, since we're talking about county levels, we wanted to begin by looking at what happened to divorce in other Florida counties. These counties were carefully selected. I'm happy to discuss how we selected these counties in more detail, but for now, we'll just say these were carefully selected counties to be comparable along social and demographic lines. And here we have the divorce rates for Hillsborough, Orange, and Escambia County. Sorry if I don't know how to say Escambia, so sorry if I just offended any Floridians here. But you can see that once again, we have falling divorce rates generally across all 4 of these counties, but that again, Duval's pattern in changing divorce rates appears to be a little bit different. Duval's divorce rate simply fell faster, particularly from 2015 to 2017. Now, we recognize that it would have been great to have 2018 data, since that's when the Culture of Freedom initiative finished, but we don't have those data quite yet. But nonetheless, it appears that Duval's divorce rate fell at a more precipitous rate than it did in comparable Florida counties. But what if we compare it to comparable counties from across the United States? Here, once again, we have the level for Duval County. And here we have it in Maricopa, Jefferson, Guilford, Cameron, and King County, Washington. This includes a few western cities like Phoenix and Seattle, as well as some other places. And you'll see once again that even though most counties fell in their overall divorce rate, the decline was particularly precipitous in Duval, even when we look at counties that match many of Duval's characteristics as closely as we can, given a statistical matching algorithm. Well, what happens if we look at a few more? Here we have Wake, Davidson, Newcastle, Anne Arundel, and Baltimore, Maryland. And you'll see that once again, this same pattern happens. Now, on that second graph, the one on your right, you'll see that in the year 2010, so we've kind of zeroed in on just the last decade here, Duval County's divorce rate was quite a bit higher than it was for these other counties, but by the year 2017, it was right there, suggesting that once again, the fall in the divorce rate was a little more precipitous than it was in other non-Florida counties. So just to recap, we've looked at divorce as a whole across the United States. We've looked at the divorce rate in Florida, other counties within Florida, and other counties that are comparable along socio-demographic lines from across the United States. And in every instance, it appears that Duval County's drop in the divorce rate really was fairly exceptional. But of course, there are other things that make Duval a particularly interesting county. And one of those things is the fact that Duval County is home to a large naval base. And we reasoned, perhaps this has nothing to do with anything other than the fact that there may have been some change associated with divorce rates in other counties that have large naval bases. Did something happen around military deployments? Is there something around military families happening here? So to get at this question, we looked at Duval's divorce rate and compared it, again, this is the number of divorces per 1,000 people in your population, to what we saw for other counties that have large naval bases, namely San Diego, California, Newport News, Virginia, and Kitsap, Washington, all of whom have large, relatively comparable sized naval bases. And once again, the pattern was clear. In most cases, the divorce rate has fallen over the past 10 years, just like it's been doing for the past 30. But the decline in Duval County was particularly precipitous. It happened. The pace of change seems to be a little bit different. So if, in fact, the fall in the divorce rate in Duval County was more precipitous than in the United States as a whole, than in Florida, than in other counties within Florida, with other comparable counties across the United States and across counties with naval bases, this suggests that there's something that we need to take a look at. And to do that, we used a statistical model. It's a version of a regression, for those of you that are familiar with it. I've chosen not to bore you with all of the minute details that make my heart really happy, but probably don't make yours quite as happy. And we put all these things into a model, but there's a couple of methodological refinements here. So first, I've only been showing you what we call the crude divorce rate, which is the number of divorces per 1,000 people in the population. But that's not the ideal measure, because after all, not everybody in the population is eligible to get divorced. You need to get married in order to get divorced. So for the statistical analyses, we used the refined divorce rate, namely the number of divorces per 1,000 married people in the population. Next, we used, many of our estimates of the divorce rate come from the American Community Survey. It's a wonderful, very large survey. It's heavily used across the US. But the problem is that those are only estimates of the divorce rate, where you can only get an estimate of the number of divorces that happen in a given county. We don't actually have the real number. So for these, we used administrative data. That is, we called as many of these counties as were willing to share their data with us, and we got the actual number of divorces that happened in these counties. So we have the estimated number of divorces and divorce rate from the ACS, and then we have the actual administrative data. And just as a side note, for the, I don't recall offhand, it's in the report, I want to say 60 or so counties for which we had administrative data, the correlation between the estimated divorce rate and the actual divorce rate was only 0.22, which is not particularly large. I think many demographers would have hoped that's a little bigger than that. Now, of course, there's a selection on which counties were willing to give us their data. There are certainly some things that make those different than other counties, but I just throw that out there to suggest there's a lot of error in the ACS estimates. Now, so we took these refined divorce rates using administrative data, and we put them in a model, and we controlled for a lot of alternative explanations for why divorce rates should fall. First off, the percent of people married in your population is going to matter. The rough income, race distribution, educational attainment, you can see these at the bottom, as well as the average age of the counties. After all, if you have a very young county, you're probably going to have less divorce because divorces don't tend to happen when you're very young. Same thing in the very older age categories, although we do have a gray divorce revolution happening. But at the end of the day, when we ran the models suggested that perhaps there is something exceptional happening to divorce in Duval County. In fact, the rate of change in divorce in Duval County was 21% quicker than it was for all of the other counties on average, suggesting that perhaps there is something exceptional about the fall in the divorce rate in Duval County. Now, we also, we also looked at every county across the United States for which we could get data in the ACS to see where Duval fit in terms of their divorce rate change from 2015 to 2017. And what we found was pretty interesting. There were 2 counties that experienced a more precipitous drop in their estimated ACS number divorce rate. One of them was New York, New York, basically Manhattan, and the other was Erie, New York. So Duval finished 3rd, which on the cheery side means that it finished better than 97, 98, almost 99% of all counties in the United States. In other words, this was a really rare circumstance that happened. Now, New York, Manhattan, I think most demographers would probably argue that it's a clear compositional difference between Duval County and New York, New York. Erie, Pennsylvania, however, did indeed appear to have a lower, a more precipitous decline in their divorce rate. So, to answer the question, number 1, was the decline in the divorce rate in Duval County exceptional? Exceptional, not necessarily unique, but pretty close. This is about the only policy evaluation or program evaluation I've ever done in my career that I couldn't knock down pretty easily. I've been on the I can knock it down pretty easily side of what Brad kind of talked about. I don't find many initiatives that I can't pretty quickly show at least had no detectable effect at the county level. Here, there's at least evidence. Now, question number 2, was the Culture of Freedom Initiative responsible for that? Did they cause that? As a statistician, I'm not prepared to say yes, but I can say that there is evidence that suggests that may be the case. It's reasonable to believe that Kofi could have contributed to this fall, but given the massive number of other things that could have affected it, I'm not prepared to say yes, it did for sure, but certainly this is one of the stronger cases that I've seen. So thank you very much. Sure.
So what I'd like to do now is to kind of give the audience an opportunity to kind of hear more about sort of the details behind the Culture of Freedom Initiative in Jacksonville, to get some sense of sort of the story that played out on the ground. And to kind of tell that story, to give us those details, I'm going to turn over the sort of the stage, if you will, to JP DeGance, who is now the head of Communio, as we mentioned just a little while ago. And he can kind of walk us through what happened in Jacksonville from his perspective. And then my colleague, Angela Ricciuti, will talk about some of her perspective on the empirical analyses that Spencer James just walked through, and then we'll have an open conversation. So JP first, and then Angela second.
Great. So I think maybe a first thing to note is that I'll quote one of the funders of our project. I think the 3-year project, there was a lot of wildcatting going on. So it's sort of language from energy investing. And if you know that field, you know that you drill a lot of dry wells. And you got to drill a lot of dry wells to hit pay dirt. And during that period, we drilled. I feel like there were a number of things that we did that we learned quickly weren't working, just in our own ability to get distribution, gain market share, get adoption. So we paid a lot of dumb taxes over 3 years. And I tell everybody that I can kind of go through a lot of the dumb taxes. We began with the idea that churches had a role to play, but not the primary role to play. So we involved secular NGOs, government entities, a lot of different players. What we thought was different, one of the things that was different between us and a federal approach was that we really embraced and wrapped our arms around the faith-based community and wanted them to have a role. What we began to learn was they were the best and most effective way to go about it. There were more than 50 churches that ended up participating in Duval County. What we saw was that churches are sticky in a way that other entities are not sticky. Okay, so if you go with your wife to an event at a church and it's your first time, somebody there is interested and passionate about meeting you and forming a friendship with you, and maybe inviting you to their home for dinner, inviting you to their small group, inviting you to something else. If you go to the local Boys and Girls Club, their membership isn't necessarily equally as passionate about drawing you into their home, okay? And we saw that. The other thing that we saw was there is perhaps the biggest impediment to success or getting adoption, where people would actually go and participate in a couples relationship education program, was the idea that there's a stigma associated with going to a couples relationship education program. The idea that if I even tell my friend that I'm going to this, I'm signaling that there's something wrong. So if I go to the local Marriage Incorporated, which is kind of the name I've coined for your local, more secularly positioned marriage nonprofit, I am kind of communicating to my friends that I'm looking for help. Whereas if I just go to First Baptist because there's a date night going on, I'm not necessarily creating that same signal. So a few things were data is important for helping to diagnose problems. We began the project with a content-heavy approach. That was some of our dumb taxes. So we led with the idea that content was king. Let's get the content distributors to mobilize through local NGOs, churches, and what have you. And what we quickly realized is everybody's competing on content, and whose content is better. We didn't want to be in that space. We weren't creating or authoring content. And there was a big pivot point where we sat down with a pastor of a church, and he let us use our model data and look at his membership. And it looked like 24% of his congregation fit into a predictive score that suggests his congregation was leading, 24% of his congregation was looking like people who had recently got divorced. And that really changed everything. So instead of leading with a mousetrap and telling them that we've got this great marriage mousetrap, you should use it, we actually just led with diagnostic, help you understand your problem. And that changed everything. That was summer of 16, and it took us a while to like re-architect what we were doing, almost the better part of a year. But we knew leading with data to help a pastor know his people, know his community, was critical to getting the pastor to take ownership of the problem. Then he took ownership of the problem and he turned to us as consultants. So what should we do? I never realized this. This particular pastor said, he would always politely say, look, I know marriage is really important. It's been important since Genesis. I'll get to it. And when we showed him the data, it changed everything. You know, for a mega church pastor to throw out his preaching calendar in July for September is a really, really hard thing to get to see done. He threw it out for the rest of the year and came to us and just for recommendations. He brought in Reengage, which is one of the best marriage enrichment programs that we know of, that evolved out of and has been developed by Watermark Church in Dallas, a large church that was similar to his church. So leading with data was really important to help a pastor take ownership of a problem. And then helping churches then go beyond their membership was really exciting to them. The idea is, I'm Catholic, so the problem that we have as Catholics is that the same 12 people come to every program at our parish. It's like the 10 little old ladies and a few other people. And so how do you get beyond those 12 people? And what we were able to do is help the pastor think creatively about looking into his community around him and inviting folks in who we thought had a felt need, and running digital ads, mail, and inviting folks in that weren't already at the church. So a pastor saw this as a way to grow his congregation. He was already motivated on the idea of solving for the problem in his congregation. So it's actually helping a church position itself as an outreach, using marriage as an outreach ministry. So those are a couple things. And then hold content loose. So we worked with Dr. Scott Stanley, who many of you in the room know. He's one of the leading academics on the efficacy of content in this space. And we recognized through his research and just talking with him that as long as the content has some core ingredients, the output in most of the evidence-based curricula isn't hugely different. So we didn't have to lean heavy on a church to say, use this. You know, we open-handed and let them know that here's a group of really good content that you can use. And then I will, you know, some fabulous people were mentioned in the report. I believe Dennis Stoica, who is a great advisor to us and helped lead this in many ways on the ground. He was the one who said, look, let's get distribution through the biggest religious communities in the county, and said, he took a look at what was the population like in those counties and said, well, look, Catholics and Baptists, those are the biggest groups. Let's hire a Baptist pastor and a Catholic couple who are known by churches in that area. And so those are the folks who are able to have conversations with churches. So those are just, I guess, some of the learnings. We started reducing the work in the secular space just because it didn't have the legs we thought. We weren't getting the bang for the buck in terms of number of people through programs. So I'll pause there.
Well, thank you, Brad, for inviting me here today. It's great to be with everybody and my colleagues on the panel. As Brad mentioned, I'm a research fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute in poverty, research fellow in poverty studies. So I'm a researcher by training, have a research background, but I also like to think of myself as a pragmatist and just commonsensical. So my comments somewhat come from that perspective. I'm going to focus on 2 points. So a number of comments that I'm going to make, or the points that I'm going to make, have been mentioned by others, Spencer and Brad and Ryan, but I'm just going to add kind of my perspective and maybe a little bit of color to that. So I want to basically focus on 2 points. So the first is just can programs, meaning programs operated by government, nonprofits, churches, can they actually influence marriage decisions? And then the second point is, if we think that they can, then is an approach like the COFI, the Freedom Initiative, is that an approach that can be effective? So to the first point, as I mentioned, I'm a researcher by training. I also spent about a decade working for city government in New York City. I generally am pretty skeptical that programming by the government or nonprofits can be effective. That's based on a lot of years looking at evidence and working for government agencies. So I generally come to programs with a healthy dose of skepticism. With that said, and as Brad mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that marriage promotion or efforts around healthy marriage are very effective, but we do have some evidence that some programs have actually produced positive results. So I think the general consensus among social scientists is that these programs are not very effective in influencing marriage. There certainly are a few programs around the country that have figured out a way to do it and to do it well. So again, my take is, in general, maybe these programs aren't very effective because maybe they're just not well run, but if somebody, and perhaps that's COFI, can find a way to do it, it can actually be effective. So to the second point is, and this is related to the report that Spencer talked about, is the Culture of Freedom Initiative, or was that what led to the declines in divorce rates that we saw? And I think that's really the main question. Would we have seen those types of declines in the divorce rate in Duval County had it not been for the Center, or for the Freedom Initiative? I think, again, as a researcher, I'm going to point out a lot of reasons that we can be skeptical of those results, but as a pragmatist, I think there's obvious evidence that there was something very unique about Duval County, and I think that it's reasonable to assume that this initiative had something to do with that. So as a researcher, I certainly can point out some of the other things that could have been going on at the time that could have resulted in these declining divorce rates. And they're things that you can't necessarily control for in the data set that Spencer was looking at. So it would have been nice had they been able to control for age of first marriage, number of children, all the other things that we think maybe would influence divorce in a particular county. Other things like just labor market mix in terms of the types of jobs that are available. I mean, these are all things that we can reasonably expect would influence divorce rates that obviously can't be controlled for in a study like this. So that's why, as a researcher, I have a little bit of skepticism that it's necessarily the Freedom Initiative that resulted in these declines in divorces. But again, as the pragmatist, there's obviously something that's going on. And so just to that point, I think there's kind of three remaining questions for me that I think would be interesting to look into further and to possibly answer. One is just so Spencer had mentioned Erie County in New York, I believe, that kind of had similar declines in divorce rates. I guess, what are some similarities between Duval County and Erie? Was there anything going on in Erie in terms of programming around marriage promotion, and just what kind of conclusions can be drawn that would maybe suggest why these two counties in particular saw similar trends in that area. The other is, and if you have a chance to read the report, you'll see this, the Freedom Initiative was implemented, I believe, or attempted to be implemented in other places, and it didn't quite take hold. And so it would be really interesting to look at, again, what was unique about Duval County, why did it take hold, and why did it not in these other counties? Because it's possible that Duval County was just ripe for an initiative like this. Again, as the skeptic, it could have been any initiative if Duval County was ripe for something, or it could have been this particular initiative. And then just the last kind of question that I would have is just to, again, kind of look at or try to control for a number of factors that maybe explained this decline. I think age when people get married is obviously one of them. Children obviously play a role. And just trying to identify like other data sources or maybe doing some qualitative research that really tries to get at some of those questions.
Spencer, you want to say anything about sort of the conversation thus far, things that sort of jumped out to you or based upon your own analyses?
So lots of more academic stuff here. The researcher in me really wants to go dig up some of those data. I don't know what's happening in Erie, New York, to be honest. I haven't taken a look at that. We didn't get a chance to examine that. Part of me is trying to figure out how, so the unit of analysis is the county, it's not the individuals. And so we could, I think I did run the models with the number of children per, or the average number of kids per household. The problem is that doesn't differ dramatically across most counties. But yeah, certainly. Like I said, I'm not prepared to say that this was, that Kofi caused this change. But there's something here. And I'm really intrigued what's going to happen with Communio going forward. I'm really intrigued to see what happens.
Yeah, I think it's maybe worth noting one of the things we started to see in one of our partners actually the lead local partner was Live the Life Ministries. And so we didn't go in waving the Culture of Freedom Initiative banner. That's an important tactical point. We stood behind churches and other front lines in helping to coordinate and fund and provide the data resources under their brands. And so in the first year, there was one of the most effective areas that we saw in marriage strengthening were what we call intensives. These are for couples who are saying they're going to get divorced, and somebody somehow gets them into a multi-day intensive where they're in a small group setting and they're working sort of couple to coach through really, really hard issues. And we attributed, just from their pre and post data, they would ask you, for all the couples that went in to their intensive, a question about your likelihood of getting divorced, and then afterwards, your likelihood of getting divorced. And just from that one program, we attributed half of all of the Duval marriages that were saved to that one program. Is the only one that actually did a pre and post questionnaire. A lot of what was delivered was, the idea was to get people through, we said 4 hour or longer programming. That was what we set the bar at. So you had to be at least 4 hours or longer. But we realized, we set that bar because we didn't want people to say they showed up to like this rally or this quick burst, entertainment activity. It had to be substantive. But when we set the bar at 4 hour, what we didn't realize is there's nothing that's really 4 hour. It's like once you do, if you look, it's either like an hour or 90 minutes, or it's like 8 hours or more. And so almost everything was 8 hours or longer in the county, and very little of it. You're working with local churches, and churches aren't big on feeling like they're being forced to do things. We weren't a government agency trying to tell them what to do. So it was a lot of, they would roll and run programs, and they'd be excited about it, and trying to get them to do programmatic evaluation was all voluntary, right? And what we decided early on was that we weren't going to, we were going to hold that loose too. We were going to let them adopt it to advance they're excited, they're passionate, we want to help them go. We recognize they were motivated, really motivated ultimately, that they have a deep love for those in their community, those in their church, and we didn't want to squash that by creating a bunch of evaluation tools. So I think that's kind of when we looked at nonprofits and government entities that are not churches versus churches, one of our other conclusions. So churches have like this unending reservoir of volunteers who are motivated out of the gospel. They have a deep love for Christ, and they want to bring it to others. And so they don't need, we don't need to pay them to go we'll pay you $100 an hour or $100 for the weekend to do this course or to administer this course. You look at the federal programs, the cost for implementing is like $5,000 plus, right? There's no reservoir of volunteers, and they're being pulled out of what's most passionate, what would most deeply motivate them, which is Jesus, and told, don't talk about Jesus, but let's save some marriages. And I think there's just really something I mean this in the most reverent way possible, there's really something to this Jesus thing. So obviously I'm a believer, and I'm speaking in a town where there's a lot of secular folks. So I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, that I think that one of the things that limits the policy community is that we're sort of, all of the biggest stuff evaluating these programs is federal dollars to evaluate, secularly delivered activity.
Okay. Why don't we open up the floor to some questions? I'm sure that there are questions out there, and so if you've got a question, please raise your hand, and we'll take it. John over there.
Yeah, Lee Habib with Salem Media. I'm Vice President of Content. Two things, JP. As you approach the pastors, because we do a lot of pastors' breakfasts with 900 pastors, and everybody's coming at the pastor to get them to do something. But you came at them with the data, so there was something in their self-interest, which is if there's a divorce, that's tithing. The tithing's gone. Right? Moreover, if you have a program that they can solve that problem with, they're also growing their ministry. Yeah. So in the end, they were acting in their self-interest. You weren't pushing them, pushing something down. What happened to church attendance? Because I think this is the big one. I mean, if you can go to pastors and say, I didn't just solve the social problem, but we drove relevance to brokenness, which is what a marriage is when it's not working. It's broken. And we solved a brokenness problem, and that's the Jesus thing, because this is what we believers, we think Jesus is the answer to brokenness. A lot of secular people may come to the church for the first time. What did they find? Were there new people who didn't know Christ who came because of this program? And what did that data reveal after the fact about a lot of the new let's face it, new dues-paying members? Because that's what you had.
Yeah, that's actually a huge part of what we learned as a go forward and how we're trying to replicate, is we recognized this mission aligns really closely with the mission of churches. So I don't know if I can show any of the slides that I brought, but I have some, I think it's relevant to the conversation. So churches that we participated with, we didn't do this immediately. We got 33 churches to baseline this, and they grew by 23% in attendance over 2 years. And this was their pew counting. Average Sunday attendance for all services over the course of a month. Okay, so it's not just like a one service. This is sustained over monthly average attendance. And then monthly giving grew by 28%. Okay, so when couples are doing better, churches were doing better, and churches said, we want to do more of this. And so that was really key. And one of the reasons that's the case, I'm going to share, we created a data set with the help of a scholar, a sociologist. I'm going to jump ahead to help, and this is sort of a leading argument we make to pastors, is that family decline is what's driving faith decline in the country. So Pew's out with data on the highest amount of religious non-affiliation in the country's history. I think it was out yesterday or 2 days ago. And what's almost never talked about is family structure as it relates to it. So this is the rate, the rates generally of, excuse the slides, they didn't convert from Keynote to PowerPoint very well. But the farthest to the left is boomers, the middle is Gen X, and the far to the right is millennials. And each group is more religiously non-affiliated than the prior group. But it's almost, we keep these as bifurcated conversations. If you're a 65-year-old boomer or a 25-year-old millennial, you're just as likely to go to church every week if I know one thing about both people, and that is whether or not you came from an intact married home. So if you grew up in an intact married home, there's only a 3-point difference in your likelihood to go to church regularly. So to put a really fine, like a exclamation on it, if you're a millennial from an intact home, you go to church, you're 78% more likely to go to church every week than a millennial from a divorced, never married, divorced and married again home. What was surprising to us and those who know family structure data was there was actually no difference between divorced and never married in terms of the behavioral outcome of going to church. And for white millennials, for instance, it's 94% more likely. So when we tell pastors is that marriage drives church health, drives community health, which we all know here, and drives, or many of us I think know here, and the church is asleep at the switch right now, respectfully, is that churches pastor like it's 1955, but we're in 2019. We partnered with the Barna Group to look at where churches are allocating resources, and only 28% of churches have a substantive marriage ministry. To dive into it a little bit, 80% of evangelical churches reported spending 0% of their dollars on marriage ministry. 82% of Catholic parishes and 94% of mainline churches all reported 0% of their annual budget is spent on marriage and relationship ministry. So I'm a glass half full guy. I always tell them is This, I would argue, is the lever point. Communio now argues, and they're sort of, we were the Culture of Freedom Initiative, and we changed our name to Communio, is that if we could strategically, over a 10-year period, close that gap so that it became ubiquitous. We're currently, both in secular philanthropy and in church giving, I think there's two very similar things. I know this from my days at the Philanthropy Roundtable, Catherine. There's a lot of focus on K-12 philanthropy to try to fix the culture. In a way that's not dissimilar from in churches, we're really focused on youth ministry to fix the backdoor problem. But in both settings, I'm arguing we're focusing on the smoke and not the fire. The fire is mom and dad, okay? If folks who dive into church data on student achievement, share of two-parent homes is a driver, okay? In church, in the idea of church participation, mom and dad are the driver. Paul Vitz, who's a scholar, NYU professor, who was an advisor to us, has a peer-reviewed thesis on the psychoanalysis of atheism. And his core argument is that a broken father relationship is frequently, he believes, is a cause of atheism. That it's hard, as he says, it's hard to know the Father's love unless you've known first a Father's love. And so we argue to churches let's close that gap. The widget for us is, we say, a data-informed full circle relationship ministry. And that's sort of our consultative approach to churches. Using data to diagnose, using data to do outreach, so that it becomes a growth engine for the church. Full circle relationship ministry is the idea of applying best practices in each of these relationship dimensions. Churches is in control. They pick the content, okay? We help advise them on how that should look, what content they should pick, what outreach strategies they should deploy. We consult with them on data, on marketing and outreach, the whole shooting match, so that they can take over the ministry long-term entirely without us, and we can go in other communities. But anyways, thanks for the question.
John Rouch over the middle, right there.
Oh, okay. I'll
grab yours,
a couple of questions on the data. First, maybe I was reading the chart wrong, but it looked like the decline started in 2015 and the program started 2016. Was I missing something there? And then the other question, what happened in the other two counties or two areas where this was tried? Do we know, and can we learn anything from the fact that perhaps it didn't work out there?
Can I quickly speak to what happened in the other two counties, and then you can go from there? So real briefly, Montgomery County, Dayton, we had, in each market, we had a local anchor organization that was our point organization. And of the three markets, Phoenix, we were getting about, after year one, close to $250 cost per person after the first year. In Jacksonville, it was about $300 a person. And in Dayton, it was like $1,800 a person. And they, great people, but they couldn't make the pivot to what we were wanting them to do. We made a mistake. One of our mistakes was we didn't think they were significantly publicly funded, but took private funding. And we don't think they could make, as a local, they didn't make the pivot to, they thought 1,800 was great because, the state of Ohio was giving them $9,000 for everything else they were doing in other areas. So we actually just stopped putting, after end of 16, we just stopped putting good money after bad, we thought. In Phoenix, we had a great anchor organization in Lazos de Familia, Family Bridges, led by Dr. Alicia Lahaz, and she's phenomenal. There are two things there. One, they never got to the share, and this was our fault, actually. We didn't capitalize them 5 times the size. They were 5 times the city, and we capitalized them very similarly, like idiots, that we did in Jacksonville. And so they did get twice the market share with similar dollars, which was great, but they needed to get to like about 5 times the distribution. The other thing that she did was we actually allowed the local to pick the problem they wanted to solve from about several different problems. Divorce was one of them. The Jacksonville Point organization, led by their chairman, Dennis Stoika, said, let's just really focus on declining divorce. Okay, we know we can do that. And they sort of didn't do other things. Alicia and Family Bridges had programming spread out between 3 different family challenge buckets. So it didn't get the volume and it was not focused. And so those are just our own perceptions of what was going on. But I'll let Spencer.
To answer the data question, perhaps apologies for being inarticulate, but so 2015 is kind of the high year, and then we see the biggest gap between 2015 and 2016, and then it sort of continues in 17. And so, yeah, and I probably just didn't articulate that well. That's where the biggest drop happened, yeah. And hopefully at some point we can get 2018 numbers so that we can really take a better look at that. Yeah.
In the middle, John Roush.
Thank you from an atheist product of a broken home. Were you able to look behind the provider, that is the churches, and evaluate what treatments they were using that were and were not effective? I don't really have a mental picture of what's going on behind the curtain inside these churches, and to what extent it's a function of programs and treatments, to what extent it's a function of community, making people feel involved and attached. What can you tell us about what's going on under the hood?
Yeah, so we actually started with the idea that increasing church attendance in and of itself was a good that we wanted to see happen, and we knew it would help actually contribute based on other data. It would, if we did increase church attendance on the whole with participating churches, it should, our hypothesis, produce fruit on the marriage side for those who are married. So cracking behind the hood, you had outreach events. Okay, there's genre of programming was outreach events to draw people in. We did not count outreach events as program. So if you came to an outreach event, it didn't count towards like our programmatic goals, but we knew outreach would allow us to draw people in from the community. So it would be something like, for instance, a comedy date night event at a church where you bring in a Christian comedian, and it was a fun night out for a couple, childcare provided. You end up getting a lot of people from the church and a lot of people from the community to come. Then you're there and you said, you guys have a good time? Well, that's great. You know, next week we're starting something, or next month we have another date night. Or there's this marriage activity starting next month. Sign up, come. So there's the outreach. Then there's types of ongoing engagement. So churches would do ongoing engagement. We still didn't count as program. That would be other forms of, the only difference between the outreach and the ongoing engagement is that the ongoing engagement, we didn't drive a lot of digital outreach for ongoing. It was, let's remarket to the people who came to the outreach event to come and become part of the community, the church community. And they would still be marriage themed and not high intensity program. And everything was to flow into, everything that we did wanted to flow into these 4-hour longer programs. So there's a few that were very commonly used. Some of them were plug and play content. So we describe content as either plug and play, which is what it sounds like. So it's couples relationship education that you can plug a DVD in, have a manual, and go through it without any training. Okay, so the Alpha Marriage course was the most plentiful plug and play piece of content in Jacksonville.
And just give us an example, like one message that would be kind of embedded in that Alpha program for an ordinary couple. Like what's the takeaway that they would get from that?
Oh, so seasons of life, okay? In the Alpha program, one of the big things that they talk about is marriage, like the seasons around us, there's seasons. And you got to understand what season you're in, and you might be struggling in a particular season, and each season comes with its own struggles. Summer, spring, fall, winter, right? So making sure, am I right on that? Okay. So, and so the content then would talk about specific challenges that come up in each season, And then there's skills-based. All the content is skills-based. So what that means is there would be questions and answers that a couple would go through to wrestle with the struggles that come up in the season that you might be in. And you'd say, well, what season are we in? And I say skills-based content, that's really important, because a lot of churches will use a sermon or a lecture and say that's our marriage thing. And we point out, and this actually comes from my buddy Dennis Stoika again. He has this great analogy. He said, I can be really entertained by watching Wimbledon. It doesn't mean I know how, after watching Wimbledon, doesn't mean I know how to play tennis. Okay? But if I actually go to something like where there's a skills-based instruction on tennis, I can actually get better at tennis. Okay, so that plug and play has skills-based elements that actually help you get better at being married. Then there's facilitator-led content. And so Live the Life actually had Adventures in Marriage. It was written by Richard Albertson, who's actually the president of Live the Life. And that'd be a couple gets trained to deliver the content. You get licensed to deliver it. And then you go into the church and you organize a all-day retreat or a multi-week series of dates where you come and for 90 minutes you work through some of the skills-based content. So you go from lower intensity to increasingly higher intensity to pull people into a community and draw them into a skills-based activity. I think one of the problems with the federal, what we learned, and this is some of our dumb taxes, we were super excited by the data, and we just started spending money to drive people from, hey, this group of people is high risk. Let's drive them into the Alpha Marriage course or to the Adventures in Marriage. What we started realizing was they were down here. We didn't have any relationship with them. The church had no relationship with them. And we were actually asking them to jump up to here. That was too high of a step. What we started to recognize is you had to actually create intermediate steps. So you get the relationship, and then they meet other people, and then you invite them to a next step. And then they're ready to take your skills-based step, which is, devoting 2 hours a night for 7 weeks, once a week for 7 weeks is a big commitment. And the feds, I don't think have ever solved this. It's why their costs are so wild. They try to go right from there to recruiting people right to program. And I think that's a mistake that we, I think, solve for.
But one more question. Yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned Dennis Stoika, and Dennis Stoika and Lori Gramer, and Lori and Don Gramer, are probably the top two Catholic, or two of the top three Catholic marriage experts in the country who know the research, know the literature, know the programs, and know how to move mountains. I would bet my money that if I put them in Dayton, Dayton would have been a success. If I put them in Phoenix, Phoenix might have been a success. They are unbelievable, and I'm worried about the replication of these findings because without millions of dollars and without people like, and you can use the secular example of Julie Baumgardner in Chattanooga or Mary Myrick in Oklahoma City. Without key people, it's not sticky. It doesn't work.
And what's your name, sorry?
I'm Bill Coffin, and I used to be in charge of or help with the federal project for 9 years. So I know them both very well. I followed what was happening in Jacksonville and in other places around the country. I do the Friday Five for Brad for the Institute of Family Studies. And I'm just worried about replication without the key ingredient, and that is the person involved.
Yeah, so let me try, that's a great, I think that's the $64,000 question, and it's been a question before we got started. Can you replicate Julie? Can you replicate Dennis? Okay, I don't think, I think the strategic element of Dennis, it was critical to our success. Dennis lived in Panama City. He wasn't beating the bushes in Duval. I mean, Scott Grogan on the Baptist side was, and Don and Lori were on the Catholic side. And then Jad Levi for Alpha was actually as well. And the key was church adoption and distribution. I think was what we fundamentally realized was the bigger key. I think in looking at, we did not do a giant catalytic kickoff saying we did no listening tour to try to convince civic leaders that we were here and we were trying to make marriage a big deal. We had no public face, big rah-rah element to what we were doing where a cult of personality leader was critical to the success of it. The ultimate success of it was distribution through the frontline church and them being able to be willing to take ownership. I think what we've designed from our learnings and working with Dennis is using data to help a pastor understand this is a big deal, this is a big problem. And we worked with a church, True Anglican here in Fairfax, and a phenomenal pastor there in Torrey Bockham. And when we finished our on-site training, his response to his team was he was willing to get rid of every form of ministry that his church had, with the exception of the Eucharist on Sunday, because this, he realized, was the most important factor, because we were able to show what was going on in the congregation, we were able to show what was going on in the community, and he was already very much interested and focused on marriage. He's more so, he was like, if you scored pastors in terms of their focus on marriage from 1 to 10, he's already a 10. But then he afterwards said, we got to do, we can do a lot more in terms of reaching out into the community. So I'm not pessimistic that we wouldn't be able to do it, because I think the star, we want to be sort of a John the Baptist strategy for growth. He must increase and we must decrease. So we want the church to be the lead and we be the supporting cast, and we don't want them to have to need us long term. So they learn how to do it and they do it, and we fade to black.
Great. Well, and on that note, we can wrap it up. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us here today at AEI.
Nice to meet you. It was interesting to learn about.